in a virtual environment. So I hope we all get sustenance somehow at the end of the day in material form, as well as the intellectual pleasures. We're going to start with Susan Dalton. 15 minutes is yours, Susan. Monica is timekeeper on this occasion. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks for the organizers of the conference too. I'm really delighted to share my work and to hear all about everyone else's. So I'll jump right in. So studies on women and popularization are having a moment in the history of science. A number of scholars working in the field have highlighted the prominent role of female figures in works like Fontenelle's Conversation on the Plurality of Worlds and Algarotti's Newtonianism for the Ladies. These female figures stood in for members of the general public who were seen as lacking in both education and rational capacities. Paul of Finland, among others, have shown how such women as Laura Bassi, professor of physics at the University of Bologna, constituted real-life counterparts of these fictional figures. In doing so, Finland has shown that women were not only the target audience of educational projects in print, but helped to make knowledge circulate themselves. So inspired by this work in the history of science, I wish to explore how two Venetian women use their roles as representatives of the public to become popularizers in the area of arts and literature. Can we go to the next PowerPoint, please? Great, thank you. So the women in question were Isabella Teotochi-Albrizzi and Justina Reni-Michiel, who you see on the screen. They both moved in rarefied social and intellectual circles around the time of the fall of the Venetian Republic in 1797. They were well connected politically and developed fruitful relationships with some of the best known men of letters in the period, including Ugo Foscolo, one of the leading Italian Romantic poets, and Melchiorre Cesarotti, a scholar of Greek literature and famous Italian translator of Ossian. So after hosting these men in conversation, Teotochi-Albrizzi and Reni-Michiel began to publish in a variety of genres, including literary portraits, translation, theater criticism, and art criticism. The next slide, please. Because of their variety, crossing modern day disciplinary boundaries, these publications are rarely studied as a whole. So historians have analyzed the historical essays, literary scholars the translations, art historians the descriptions of sculptures and paintings. I believe that taken together, they constitute a form of light reading, a literatura amena, that was becoming increasingly popular in late 18th century Venice. So novels, periodicals, books of letters, travel literature, all vied for the attention of editors. All vied for the attention of readers in a widening print market. So letteratura amena clearly aimed to divert, but authors and editors often insisted on its moral function. Next slide, please. This was certainly the case for well-known author and journalist Gasparo Gozzi, the creative force behind the Gazzetta Veneta. Motivated by a long-standing interest in education, Gozzi believed that new print genres he produced, both the novel, and here I'm thinking about the novel and installations that constituted Il Mondo Morale, and a new light form of periodical could lead the reader to virtue by awakening his or her passions. Next slide, please. Indeed, as the public became a growing political and cultural force across Europe in the 18th century, men and women of letters were increasingly preoccupied with ensuring the virtue of its members. In the context of northern Italy, men such as Melchiorre Cesarotti, Aurelio Bertola, Ugo Foscolo, Ippolito Pindemonte shared the belief that art and literature could improve its audience by touching its heart. For example, Cesarotti saw an important role for compassion in the theater. By identifying with the plight of the tragic hero, the spectator would feel terror at the hero's eventual downfall and thus be impelled to choose a different path. But if these men believed in the pedagogical function of art and literature, they also worried about the public's ability to find, choose, and interpret artistic and literary material that would be morally improving. Given the public's lack of education and, in their view, its propensity towards excess sensibility, there was a danger it would be drawn to frivolous entertainment that would debase rather than uplift it. So Men of Letter proposed a number of different solutions to this problem, including the creation of institutions and the identification of individuals who would guide the viewing and reading public. So poet Ippolito Pindemonte proposed the creation of a national journal to serve as an arbiter of national taste, whereas Melchiorre Cesarotti put forward a similar idea, suggesting a literary tribunal to judge the quality of literary works. So individuals working in the world of print had similar ideas and suggested that journalists, editors, and critics could lead readers and viewers to appropriate material through introductory texts, descriptions, reviews, and explanatory notes. All of the intermediaries proposed to guide the public were imagined unreflexively as male. And yet women like Renier Michiel and Teotoki Albrizzi were able to mobilize their social capital and also common ideas about femininity to claim this role of mediator for themselves. They did not produce anthologies or periodicals, but their publications served the same function. So they brought together, they simplified texts, they explained them, in addition to modeling their own sensible reception. Moreover, they used their position as members of the general public, again defined by their limited education and limited rationality, to their advantage. So, seen as sharing the general public's defining characteristics, they were well placed to understand its needs. Can we go to the next slide, please? So to illustrate, today I'm going to concentrate very briefly on two publications, one from each woman, Teotoki Albrizzi's descriptions of Antonio Canova's sculptures, and Justina Renier-Michiel's translations of Shakespeare. I'm going to begin with Renier-Michiel's translations of Shakespeare. So Michiel translated three tragedies, Othello, Macbeth, and Coriolanus at the very end of the 18th century, and had the distinction of being the first to publish translations of these plays in Italian, and hers were prose translations. Here, her choice made sense given her particular context. Interest in Shakespeare had been growing in Italy throughout the 18th century, and theater life was particularly vibrant in 18th century Venice, the city of Goldoni. But more than mere spectacle, theatrical performances were prized for their social role. As we've seen, her contemporaries thought of the theater as being morally instructive, operating through the mechanisms of compassion and terror. So Renier Michiel built on this idea and justified the publication of her translations by noting that she wanted to provide edifying reading material for her adult daughters. But in fact, I think the project was born of Michiel's own scholarly interests that demanded years of work on her part and brought her into contact with her contemporaries who she consulted and led her to consult various printed texts, including Pierre Le Tournel's French translations, English editions of the play, and existing essays on Shakespeare. So some other scholars have underlined this, and in line with Alessandra Calvani, I'd like to focus on the critical apparatus of the plays, in my case particularly the critical apparatus to Othello, the first volume to be published, with the goal of really bringing out Renier Michiel's editorial role. So in preparing the introduction and notes to Othello, Michiel consulted, as I said, a variety of different texts. She cut them, she rearranged them, she summarized them, all with the view of providing her readers with the material they needed to have access to the meaning and beauty of Shakespeare's words. So in her own introduction to the play, she brought together a series of Le Tournel's texts that constitute his own introduction, including his letter to the king, Jubilee de Shakespeare, Vie de Shakespeare, All together, Little Nell's texts were 130 pages of text, which Renier Michiel brought down to just 19, including some of her own thoughts. Similarly, in the notes, she borrowed not only from Latourneur, but also from Stockdale's single volume edition of Shakespeare in 1784, as well as other texts, including Elizabeth Montagu's essay on Shakespeare. And could you go to the next slide, please? So here you see an example of her editing work in which she moved from one source to the other to supply relevant notes to the play. Michiel also edited almost half of her notes and the material that she borrowed in some way. So that meant that she not only omitted certain words and passages, sometimes she can combine the text from various sources in a note, sometimes she summarized the content. She also left out references to sexuality that she deemed indecent, but also omitted notes providing information on Italy and Venice that she thought her readers would have no use for. Can we go to the next slide, please? So a second example of popularization comes from Teotoki Albrizzi's descriptions of Antonio Canova's sculptures. The work came out in 2 editions, the first published in 1809, and the second complete edition was published from 1821 to 24. The second edition contained 148 descriptions, each with its own outline engraving, and you can see a copy example on the screen. So the work enjoyed international success and was translated into German and into English. So these descriptions represent another model of popularization where Teotoki Albrizzi presents her own receptions of the sculpture in her words, and I have translations here, my own translations from the Italian. I have simply limited myself to describing the effects that his marvelous works awoke in my soul, with the modest hope that I will have excited in others the commotion that I myself felt. So the illustrations were obviously important. They gave the viewer a point of reference to meditate on. Nonetheless, the image itself was insufficient to ensure readers would feel the full effects of the sculptures. And Teotoki Albrizzi took it upon herself to guide the viewer in his or her appreciation of the works. So, for example, she'd point out different features of the sculptures. Can we go to the next slide, please? For example, regarding Canova's statue of George Washington, she wrote that the, and I quote here, grandeur of style, the frankness and freshness of his chisel, the truth of imitation are of unparalleled value in this simulacrum. In addition to pointing out elements that the audience should appreciate, Albrizzi also provided context for the pieces as a way of ensuring the appropriate reactions. So regarding the funerary stele created for Fausto Tadini, Albrizzi described the tragic circumstances of his death. So the young poet died when crushed by a wall of his future home. His prescient mother, who was present and who was concerned for his safety during the renovations, suggested that he move to another seemingly secure location to oversee the work, but in fact, it was on this very spot that part of the building gave way, burying him beneath it. And the mother's reaction, seeing her son disappear before her eyes, and I quote, "A mother's heart could well imagine, she seemed to turn to stone." So how were these works received? Very positively. I referred to the reeditions, but their various publications also received positive reviews in periodicals. Moreover, several reviewers and biographers pointed out the role that each woman played in vulgarizing material for their audience. So as a last example, I just want to read a passage from a text that was written by an anonymous French author after Teotoki Albrizzi's death, where he wrote that her descriptions were able to, and I quote again, it's my translation, to strike and move the viewer and inspire in him interest, love, pity, and veneration. All of the varied moral impressions arrive in succession in the soul of the author, so that's Teotokya Abritsi, who, placing herself between the causes and effects, participates at once in the laws of beauty that guided the artist and the emotions given to the spectator. So you really see her intermediate role here. So in short, as much as men of letters imagined this cultural intermediary that was necessary to guide the mixed public to moral improvement as male, both Renimi Kiel and Teotokya Abritsi were able to appropriate this role for themselves and did so with the approval of their contemporaries. Thank you.